One of the absolute best ways to catch bass in cold water is with a crankbait. And today I want to dive into that exactly, cold water cranking. So stay tuned, it's going to be a good one.
There's one. That might not be a bass. And he's acting like a smallmouth. This is a smallmouth seed. Yes, sir. That's got a 3.5, 4.
When it comes to fishing in cold water, there are 4 tips that are really, I think, necessary for you to know. If you understand and know these 4 tips, you're gonna be a lot better fisherman in cold water, especially when it comes to fishing crankbait. Now, the first tip that I wanna talk about is the crankbait itself. And anytime you're fishing in cold water, you want to have a tight wiggling crankbait. There's a lot of crankbaits on the market that are wider wiggling crankbaits. You know, a lot of the crankbaits that I use in the summer, like square bill crankbaits and deep diving crankbaits, they tend to have a little bit wider wiggle to them. And those style baits really don't work the best in cold water. Now, I'm not saying that you're not going to catch one in cold water, but what really tends to work the best is a tight wiggling crankbait. Really, the thing is that those wide wiggling crankbaits, they're just too much for a fish in cold water. As we know, bass are cold-blooded, as well as other fish species and other organisms that are in the water. So their metabolism slows and they're just a little bit more lethargic. They're not always moving as much, and so therefore sometimes if you have a very aggressive, wide wobbling crankbait that's coming through the water at them, they know that something is not right with whatever that is that's going by them, and if it doesn't spook them, they're just not going to bite it because it's just too much for them. So fishing a tight wiggling crankbait is really a must, and it's really the first thing that you should know before you even get out on the water. Now, there are a lot of great tight wiggling crankbaits on the market. A couple that really work very well in cold water are a bait like a Rapala Shad Rap. This is a lure that has been used for a long time. It's known as a great cold water crankbait. The only thing about that bait is it's pretty light, especially some of the smaller ones. They are a pretty light bait, so a lot of times if you are fishing them, you might want to fish them on a spinning rod and reel setup to be able to get just a longer and better cast. Another great crankbait that I love in cold water is a Rapala DT6. This bait really isn't as flat as some of your other baits, so I tend to only use it when that water temperature is kind of in like the upper 40-degree range and definitely in the low 50s. That's kind of a great range for this crankbait, and it can cast really well on a bait cast rod and reel. Now, the cold water crankbait that is probably my favorite, it's the one that I've really fallen in love with over the last couple of years, is this little Berkley Fritz side crankbait. As you can see, this is a flat-sided crankbait. It's a very tight wiggling crankbait, and although I've caught bass with this crankbait in warm water, this to me is one of the best really cold water crankbaits that you can buy. Pretty much anytime you're fishing in the 40-degree range, from 40 to 49, this is the crankbait that I'm going to pick up. And it comes in a lot of different sizes, and it comes at different running depths, and we'll talk about depth here in just a minute. But before I go on in the video, I just want you to know that this crankbait is typically around that like $9.50 to $10 mark, and right now for another couple of days I think it's only like $7.50 at sportsmansoutfitters.com. Sportsman's Outfitters has had deals pretty much ever since November on a ton of different lures, and it's no different right now with these crankbaits. You can buy them for like $7 as opposed to almost $10 anywhere else that you're gonna find them. So if you guys wanna pick up some Berkley Fritz side crankbaits along with some other baits, click that link down below in the description and you can save a lot of money right now for a limited time at sportsmansoutfitters.com. Now, one of the biggest things that you need to pay attention to whenever you're fishing a crankbait in cold water is speed and or cadence. Speed is a big thing pretty much anytime you fish a crankbait. Now, during the summer, I'm gonna use a lot of speed. Really get that bait moving fast to create different reaction strikes when it's down there in the water. Now, during the winter and during cold water, most of the time, it's the exact opposite for me. Most of the time, if I'm fishing a crankbait like this, I'm gonna cast that bait out, I'm gonna get it down where it's hitting the bottom, and then I'm really gonna just start creeping that bait along pretty much as slow as I can while keeping it on the bottom. Now, there may be times where you can get away with cranking it a little bit faster, and really this all just comes down to experimenting, kind of figuring out and dialing what the fish are doing. If you're reeling it at a certain pace and you feel like the fish are hitting it and not getting hooked up, then slow it down even further. Another thing, and why I said cadence at the beginning of this, is cadence. You know, we think a lot about cadence when we're talking about a topwater bait or a jerk bait, but cadence with a crankbait is also something that you want to think about. And what I mean by cadence is actually how you work the bait under the water. It's not always just a steady pace, a steady reel in. What I like to do a lot, especially when I'm fishing cold water, is actually sweep my rod and let that bait kind of stop and pause and float up just a second and then keep on going. That is huge, guys. That's a cadence. That is a technique that I can't tell you how big that is sometimes. There are days when you're gonna go out fishing and you're gonna be working the bait that way with that cadence, where you're pulling the rod, you're pausing it, you're letting it float up, and you're getting 4, 5, 6 times as many bites as your friend in the back of the boat who's simply just reeling that bait in. So I can't tell you, and I can't stress to you how important it is, but cadence is huge, speed is huge. Dialing in what the speed is the bass like is really gonna help you to catch a lot more bass cold water cranking. The third big tip that is extremely important to remember when you're fishing a crankbait in cold water is depth. And I'm talking about the depth of your crankbait, how deep it runs. We want to try to get the maximum depth out of that bait in cold water, because when you're fishing in cold water, a lot of times fish are going to be relating to some sort of deep water. Like I talk about in a lot of my videos, deep is relative. Deep could be 8 foot of water in a pond, and deep could be 20 foot of water in a lake. Now, the bass aren't always going to be sitting really deep. Sometimes they may be sitting on a little bit of a lip that drops from 5 foot of water to 20 foot of water, or maybe they're on a creek channel bank and they're only about 6 or 7 foot down, even though that creek channel drops into 30 foot of water. But getting the maximum amount of depth with your crankbait can sometimes be the deal in order to get more bites and catch more fish in cold water. Now, baits like the Fritz side that I talked about earlier, it actually comes in a lot of different depths. You have depths that go anywhere from 2 foot all the way down to 9 foot, and it really kind of covers the spectrum of depths that you're going to be fishing a lot of times with a crankbait. But sometimes you want to get a bait like this. This is a Fritz side 5 Junior. Okay, it's a very small bait, and sometimes you want to get the maximum depth out of this bait. So therefore, the best thing to do is actually fish it on a spinning rod with lighter pound test. Fishing 8-pound test or maybe even 6-pound test is really gonna allow this bait to dive deeper in the water. And like I talked about, depth can really help you to catch a lot more fish when you're cold water cranking. All right, so the last thing that I wanna talk about today, and this is basically where I find cold water bass 98% of the time, and that is around rock. Pretty much anytime I'm fishing a crankbait in cold water, I'm targeting rocky areas. Now, rocky could be a lot of different things. This could be like a naturally rocky bank. A lot of times a creek channel swing where that main creek channel kind of hits the bank, you're gonna have some bigger rock on those type of areas. That's a great bank for a crankbait. Another rocky area that a lot of us have in different lakes is riprap. And if you have riprap that's actually next to some deeper water, that can be another great area to catch bass during winter and during cold water months. This could also be something that's underwater, like an underwater hump or an underwater point that maybe it just rises up to about 6 or 7 foot on top and then it drops down drastically on the sides. that is another place where that crankbait can be really, really good. Again though, you really wanna have some depth close by, but the reason that I like to target that rock is because even when you have cold temperatures, if you have the sun shining down, it's actually gonna warm up that rock a little bit, and it's actually gonna provide a little bit of heat, a little bit of warmth for that bass. It may not be a lot, it may be just a degree or two, but it's enough to get the bass to kind of cling to that rock and lay with their bellies literally sitting on that rock. So rock, whether that's rocky banks or whatever it may be, that is the #1 type of cover that I'm going to target when it comes to fishing a cold water crankbait. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to take a look at those Fritz side crankbaits right here. And if you wanna know more about cold water bass fishing, I made a video about the 4 S's of cold water bass fishing. If you go by these 4 S's, it's gonna allow you to catch bass in cold water almost every single time. I'm gonna link that video right there. Please subscribe to the channel, comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.